The worst part isn't the sound itself. It's the silence that comes right after. It's the kind of absolute, profound quiet that feels heavy, like a blanket being pressed down on your ears. It's a silence that listens. I know that now. I learned it on the night I finally heard it breathing. I was lying perfectly still in my bed, my heart hammering a frantic, muffled rhythm against my ribs. I hadn't slept in what felt like a week. My eyes were wide open, staring into the oppressive, ink-blot darkness of my bedroom, and that's when I heard it. A slow, dry inhale, a long, rattling exhale. It wasn't my breath. It was too close to be coming from anywhere else in the house, yet too distant to be right next to me. It seemed to exist in the very air of the room, a sound with no source. I held my own breath, my lungs burning, and listened. Inhale, exhale. And in the thick, waiting silence between those breaths, I understood that I was not alone. I hadn't been for a very, very long time. Before my life unraveled into this waking nightmare, it was quiet. Intentionally so. I'm an architectural draftsman. I work from home, translating the broad, sweeping ideas of architects into precise, detailed blueprints. It's a job of specifics, of millimeters and load-bearing capacities. It requires focus, patience, and above all, silence. I'd inherited my grandfather's house just outside of Olympia, Washington, about 2 years ago. It was perfect. Tucked back from a winding country road on a 3-acre lot dense with ancient Douglas firs and damp, mossy ferns. The house itself was a classic mid-century rambler, built in the 50s with good bones, thick walls, hardwood floors, a big fieldstone fireplace. My grandfather had been a man who valued solitude, and he'd built his life to reflect that. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road, completely obscured by a thick curtain of evergreen trees. My days fell into a comfortable, predictable rhythm. I'd wake up with the weak gray light filtering through the pines, make a pot of strong coffee, and sit at my drafting table in the spare bedroom that I'd converted into an office. The only sounds were the scratching of my pen on vellum, the quiet hum of my computer, the drip of relentless Pacific Northwest rain on the roof. I loved it. The silence was a canvas for my thoughts. It was productive, peaceful. The house had its own quiet language, as old houses do. The groan of the floorboards as the temperature changed, the gentle sigh of the radiators in the winter, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall that I only wound out of a sense of tradition. These were comfortable domestic sounds. They were the sounds of a house at rest. They were random, predictable, and above all, unintentional. My work often kept me up late. I'd be hunched over my table at 2 or 3 in the morning, lost in the intricate lines of a floor plan, the rest of the world asleep. The house would be steeped in that deep, rural darkness, a blackness so complete it felt like you could touch it. It was during one of those late nights, about 6 months ago, that I heard the first strange sound. It was a single, sharp tap. It sounded like a knuckle rapping once against a wooden door. It was clear, distinct, and it came from the direction of the living room. I stopped drawing, my pen hovering over the paper. I listened. The only reply was the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I shrugged it off. Old house. A branch tapping a window, maybe, the heat making a pipe knock. A dozen rational explanations came to mind. I went back to work, the sound forgotten before the ink on my pen had dried. A few nights later it happened again. Same time, around 2:15 a.m. A single clear tap. This time I got up. I walked into the living room, my bare feet cold on the hardwood floor. The huge picture window looked out onto the blackness of the front yard. There were no branches close enough to touch the glass. I checked the front door. It was locked, solid. I stood in the middle of the room, listening, feeling a little foolish. The house was silent, dead silent. The kind of silence that makes you aware of the blood pumping in your own ears. I went back to my desk, a tiny thread of unease stitched into the fabric of my piece. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was just a question mark, a piece that didn't fit. The tapping became a semi-regular occurrence, always late at night, always that single, solitary knock. I started to subconsciously anticipate it. I'd find myself pausing my work around 2:00 a.m. waiting. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. The inconsistency was almost more unnerving than the sound itself. Then, a new sound was added to the vocabulary. It was a faint scraping, like a piece of heavy furniture being dragged a few inches across a wooden floor. It came from the master bedroom, at the opposite end of the house from my office. The first time I heard it, I spent half an hour searching the room, seeking the heavy oak dresser and the bed frame, looking for any sign they had moved. There was nothing. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. This is where the shift began, where the rational explanation started to feel thin like old, worn-out fabric. The sounds were still isolated, still explainable on their own. A knock, a scrape. But together they started to feel like a sequence, like a language I didn't understand. I began to keep a log, a little notebook I kept on my desk. I jot down the time, the date, the type of sound, and its location. October 12th, 2:18 a.m., single tap, living room. October 15th, 3:04 a.m., scrape, master bedroom. October 16th, 1:45 a.m., tap, hallway, outside office. Looking at the list, there was no discernible pattern in the timing or location. The only pattern was that they were happening and with increasing frequency. The turning point, the moment that simple unease curdled into genuine cold sweat fear, came on a Tuesday night in early November. The rain was coming down in sheets, a constant drumming on the roof that usually soothed me. I was feeling particularly on edge. I'd heard a tapping sound earlier, but this one was different. It wasn't from a specific location. It sounded like it was coming from inside the wall right next to my desk. I'd spent 10 minutes with my ear pressed against the cold drywall, listening, hearing nothing but the frantic thumping of my own heart. I decided to call it a night, feeling jumpy and exhausted. I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I set the glass down on the granite countertop, it made a distinct clink. I stood by the sink drinking, and a few seconds later I heard it. From the dining room, a perfect echo of that sound. A faint but unmistakable clink. I froze, the glass halfway to my mouth. My blood went cold. It wasn't like a house settling. It wasn't a pipe. It was a precise, specific sound that had just occurred, a mimicry. I stood there for a full minute motionless, my ears straining in the dark, silence. My mind was racing, trying to build a logical framework around what I just heard. It was a coincidence. The dishwasher settling. A mouse in the wall knocking something over. Anything. I needed it to be anything else. Test it, I did something I immediately regretted. I took a deep breath, and with a trembling hand I tapped my fingernail on the granite countertop. 1, 2, 3, tap, tap, tap. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Just as I was about to let out a relieved breath, convincing myself I was losing my mind, the reply came. From the hallway this time. Fainter, softer, like it was coming from much farther away, but perfectly mimicking my rhythm. Tab, tab, tab. That was it. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't random. It wasn't the house. These sounds were intentional. That realization changed everything. Sleep, which had already been growing shallow, became impossible. I'd lie in bed for hours, my body rigid, listening. Every normal creak and groan of the house became amplified, menacing. Was that the wind, or was that a whisper? Was that a floorboard settling, or was it a footstep? The silence was the worst. The waiting. I would lie there, sweating in the cold room, and the utter lack of sound would feel like a presence, a held breath. I was being watched, I was sure of it. Watched and listened to. My work began to suffer. I couldn't concentrate. I'd stare at a blueprint for an hour, my mind not on the lines and numbers but on the acoustics of the house. I tried to find the source. I spent an entire weekend in the crawlspace under the house, a dusty, spider-web-filled maze of pipes and support beams. I found nothing. I went into the attic, a hot, cramped space that smelled of old insulation and baked pine needles. Nothing. I tapped on every wall, listening for hollow spots. I checked every window, every door, every floorboard. The house was solid, secure. There was no way in or out that I didn't know about. There was no one here, but there was something. The exhaustion was a physical weight. It made my limbs feel heavy, my thoughts syrupy and slow. I had dark, bruised-looking circles under my eyes. My hands had a constant tremor. I started drinking coffee late into the night, not to work, but just to stay awake. I was terrified of falling asleep. I had this irrational fear that if I slept, whatever was making the noises would get closer. That sleep was a form of surrender. The mimicry became more elaborate. It was a cruel, subtle game. I'd push my chair back from my desk, and a moment later, a faint scraping sound would echo from the guest bedroom. I'd jingle my keys in my hand, and a soft, metallic rustling would answer from the kitchen. It was always quiet, always just on the edge of hearing, so faint that if you weren't listening for it, you'd miss it. It was smart. It knew how to hide in the ambient noise of the house. It knew how to make me question my own sanity. My sister, Sarah, called me one afternoon. My voice was hoarse from lack of sleep and too much coffee. "Alex, you sound terrible," she said, her voice full of concern. "I'm fine, Sarah, just working a lot." "You say that every time. Are you eating? You sound like you've lost weight." I tried to sound normal, casual. "Of course, just stressed, big project." "You need to take a break. Come down to Portland for the weekend. We'll go out, get some decent food." The thought of leaving the house filled me with a strange, dual emotion. A desperate, clawing need to escape, and a powerful, paralyzing fear of what might happen if I left it empty. What would it do if its audience was gone? "I can't," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. "I'm on a deadline." "Alex, you're going to burn yourself out. Is everything okay with the house?" I hesitated. I wanted to tell her, I wanted to scream it. "There's something in the walls, it mimics me. It's trying to talk to me or drive me insane, and I can't tell which." But how could I say that? She'd think I was having a breakdown. She'd insist I see a doctor, that I was just overworked and hearing things. She was a nurse, practical and grounded. She wouldn't understand. She would try to explain it away, and I couldn't bear that. I needed someone to believe me, and I knew she wouldn't. "The house is fine," I lied. "It's an old house, you know, makes some noises, but it's fine." "Well, okay, but get some sleep, seriously. You sound like a ghost." The call ended, and the silence that rushed back and felt more profound, more isolating than ever. She was right. I was becoming a ghost in my own home. A pale, haunted observer flitting from room to room, notebook in hand, documenting my own descent. I decided I needed proof. I needed something tangible, something I could show someone, Sarah, the police, anyone, that would prove I wasn't crazy. I ordered a set of high-sensitivity audio recorders online. When they arrived, I felt a surge of something like hope. I placed them all over the house, one in my office, one in the living room, one in the hallway, and one in my bedroom. That night, I sat at my desk, the little green lights on the recorders glowing reassuringly in the dark. I performed a series of tests. I coughed. I tapped a pencil on the desk. I cleared my throat. I waited for the replies. They came as I knew they would. A faint cough from the living room, a tiny tapping from the bedroom. I felt a grim satisfaction. I had it. I spent the entire next day listening to the recordings, my best headphones clamped over my ears. It was maddening. On the raw audio, the sounds were almost imperceptible. They were buried in the low-level hiss of the recordings, the ambient hum of the house. I could hear them because I knew what to listen for, but when I tried to isolate the sound, to amplify it, it just dissolved into static. It was acoustically slippery. It was as if the sounds were designed to exist only in the moment, to be heard by the human ear but to defy mechanical capture. My proof was nothing more than a series of faint, inconclusive pops and crackles. My hope dissolved, leaving behind a residue of pure despair. It knew. Whatever this thing was, it knew I was trying to record it, and it was deliberately staying just below the threshold of proof. The paranoia began to eat me alive. I started to see intent in everything. The flicker of a light bulb wasn't faulty wiring, it was a signal. A shadow moving in my peripheral vision wasn't just my own movement, it was something darting out of sight. The house, my sanctuary, had become a prison, and I was both the inmate and the warden. My world had shrunk to these four walls and the intelligence that haunted them. I stopped trying to rationalize. I stopped trying to find a source. I moved into a phase of pure, terrified observation. I started to think of it as a living entity, not a ghost, not something supernatural in the classic sense. It felt more fundamental, like an intelligence that had been sleeping in the wood and the stone and the silence, and I had somehow woken it up with my own quiet, solitary life. Maybe it was lonely. Maybe it was trying to communicate in the only way it knew how, by reflecting what it heard. This thought that it was trying to communicate was the most terrifying of all. What did it want to say? The mimicry became my sole focus. I started to see a new pattern. It wasn't just mimicking sounds anymore. It was mimicking rhythm, the rhythm of my life. I had a habit of pacing when I was thinking, 3 steps one way, turn, 3 steps back. One night I heard a faint, muffled thumping from under the floorboards that matched my pacing perfectly. Thump, 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 pause, thump, thump, thump. It was learning me. My habits, my cadences, my very presence. The lack of sleep was now a serious problem. I was starting to have micro-sleeps, nodding off for a few seconds at my desk and waking with a jolt. The world had taken on a shimmering, unreal quality. Colors were too bright, sounds were too sharp. I felt disconnected from my own body. One afternoon, I was looking in the bathroom mirror and I barely recognized the person staring back. My face was gaunt. My skin was pale and waxy, and my eyes were the worst. They were wide, bloodshot, and darting back and forth as if I was constantly tracking something no one else could see. I had to sleep. I just had to. I hadn't had more than an hour or two of broken, nightmare-filled rest in over a week. I decided I would drug myself to sleep. I found an old bottle of prescription sleeping pills from when I'd hurt my back a year prior. I knew I shouldn't, but I was desperate. I took 2, double the recommended dose, and washed them down with water. I lay down in my bed, fully clothed, and pulled the covers up to my chin. The pills hit me fast, a heavy, chemical wave rolling through my body, dragging my consciousness down into a thick, syrupy darkness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was going to sleep. I was going to be silent. My last thought as my eyes drifted shut was a sliver of hope that if I was quiet, maybe it would be quiet too. I was wrong. I woke up a few hours later. It wasn't a gradual waking. It was a sudden, violent snap back to consciousness, like my brain had been doused with ice water. The room was utterly black, the sleeping pills leaving a foul, metallic taste in my mouth and a leaden weight in my limbs. But it wasn't the grogginess that had woken me. It was the silence. The house was dead quiet, too quiet. The normal hum of the refrigerator was gone. The gentle ticking of the clock in the hall had stopped. It was a vacuum, an absolute absence of sound that felt unnatural, pressurized. And then I heard it. It started so quietly I thought it was the blood in my own ears, a soft, wet, rhythmic sound. It was a sound I knew intimately, the sound I heard every second of every day but had never truly listened to. It was the sound of breathing, a slow, deep, dry inhale and a long, rattling, almost wheezing exhale. It wasn't mine. I held my own breath instantly, my chest tight and burning. I listened. It continued, steady as a metronome. Inhale, exhale. It was in the room with me. The sound had a strange quality. It wasn't coming from the closet or from under the bed or from the corner of the room. It seemed to be emanating from the darkness itself, from the very air molecules around me. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, pure, disembodied sound. My mind, sluggish from the drugs, struggled to make sense of it. There was no one here. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. I was alone, but my ears were telling me something different. My ears were telling me I was lying inches away from a breathing creature. I lay there, petrified, for what could have been minutes or an hour. Time had ceased to mean anything. My world was reduced to the space of my bed, the suffocating darkness, and that horrible, intimate sound. I had to know. I had to see. With a surge of adrenaline that cut through the fog of the sleeping pills, I slowly, carefully began to reach for the lamp on my bedside table. My hand trembled violently. My fingers brushed against the cold metal base, fumbled for the switch. The breathing continued, steady, calm, completely unconcerned with my movement. I clicked the lamp on. The room was flooded with soft, yellow light. It was empty, completely, utterly empty. The heavy oak dresser stood against the far wall. My clothes were slung over a chair in the corner. The closet door was shut. There was no one here. I sat bolt upright, my eyes scanning every inch of the room, every shadow, every corner. Nothing. And in the instant the light had come on, the breathing had stopped. The silence that rushed in was deafening, absolute. I sat there panting, my body drenched in a cold sweat. Was I hallucinating? Was this what sleep deprivation finally did to a person? Had my mind, so obsessed with sound, finally just manufactured one? It felt so real. The thought that I was finally losing my mind was, in a strange way, almost a comfort. It was an explanation. It meant I wasn't being haunted by some impossible, invisible entity. It meant I was just sick. I left the light on. I couldn't bear the thought of the darkness again. I swung my legs out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor. My entire body was shaking. I needed to get out of this room. I stood up, and as my full weight settled on the floorboards, they let out a loud creak. And from the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest, the breathing started again. I froze, one foot in front of the other. It was softer this time, more tentative. Inhale, exhale, it was there. It was real. My movement had triggered it. It was responding to me. This wasn't a hallucination. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I stood, rooted to the spot, listening. The beat. Breathing was a constant, a slow, patient rhythm in the quiet room. It felt ancient, predatory. I took a shaky step towards the door. The breathing stopped. I waited. Silence. I took another step. Again the breathing stopped the instant my foot touched the floor. It was a game. A horrifying, sadistic game of red light, green light. It was telling me, I know you're there. I know every move you make. I can stop and start at will. I stood there in the middle of my own bedroom, a prisoner of sound and silence. I couldn't move because movement made it stop, and the silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself. It was a silence full of intent, of patient waiting. I felt like a mouse being toyed with by a cat. I don't know how long I stood there. My legs began to ache. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling hollowed out and weak. The breathing in the corner remained silent. The entity, whatever it was waiting for me. I had to get out. I had to get out of the house. I closed my eyes, took a ragged breath, and I ran. I bolted for the bedroom door, not caring about the noise I was making. My feet pounded on the floor, the door flew open with a crash, and I scrambled into the hallway. The breathing didn't start again, but something else happened, something far, far worse. As I stood in the dim hallway panting, my back pressed against the wall, a new sound began. It wasn't a tap, it wasn't a scrape, it wasn't breathing, it was a whisper. A dry, sibilant whisper like the sound of sand scouring stone or dead leaves skittering across pavement. And it was forming a word, my name. It didn't come from one place. Like the breathing, it was acousmatic, seeming to emanate from the very structure of the house. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, it was all around me. It was a chorus of whispers, a single voice coming from everywhere at once. A-L-E-X. The voice was not human. It was a rendering of a human sound, a perfect mimicry of the phonetics, but with no life, no warmth. It was the sound of utter emptiness. It was the silence itself, given a voice. And it knew my name. That was what broke me, the intimacy of it. For months it had been a distant, abstract thing, a series of knocks and scrapes. Then it had moved into my room, sharing the air I breathed. Now it was speaking to me, it knew me. And its voice was the sound of the grave. I didn't scream. The sound was trapped in my throat, a knot of pure terror. My mind just snapped. The connection between thought and action severed. I was pure instinct, pure flight response. I turned and ran. I ran through the living room, knocking over a lamp in the dark. I didn't stop to find my keys or my wallet or my phone. I fumbled with the deadbolt on the front door, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. The lock finally clicked open. I threw the door open and ran out into the cold, damp night, the wet grass soaking my socks, the icy air burning my lungs. I ran down my long gravel driveway and I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until the flashing lights of a gas station appeared like a beacon in the distance. I live in the city now, a tiny 3rd-floor apartment that overlooks a 6-lane freeway. I never told anyone the full story. I told my sister I had a breakdown from stress and couldn't handle the isolation of the house anymore. She helped me arrange the sale. I sold it at a huge loss to a development company that was just going to tear it down and subdivide the lot anyway. The realtor told me the inspector they sent out had made a strange comment. He said it was the quietest house he'd ever been in. Unsettlingly quiet were his exact words. I can't be in a quiet room anymore. I have a fan running in my apartment 24 hours a day. I keep the TV on even when I'm not watching it. I sleep with headphones on, playing white noise, the sound of rain, the sounds of a city, anything to fill the space to keep the silence at bay. But sometimes, in the brief pause between a passing siren and the hum of the traffic below, I can almost feel it. That deep, listening quiet. And I know it's not the house. It was never the house. The house was just an amplifier, an empty place where it could be heard. I don't know what it was. An entity, a presence, an intelligence born of solitude and silence. I don't think it was evil. I don't think it wanted to hurt me. I think it was just curious and lonely. And in my own solitude it found a kindred spirit. It learned my sounds, my rhythms, my name. It tried to communicate. But some things aren't meant to speak to each other. Some silences aren't meant to be broken. I stopped sleeping because I realized the sounds were intentional. But now I can't sleep because I'm terrified of the silence. I'm terrified of what might be listening in the quiet moments of my own life, waiting patiently to learn my new name in my new home. I am telling you this because you need to know. You need to listen to the sounds in your own home. And when your house falls silent, when you find yourself in that deep, perfect quiet, you need to ask yourself, are you listening to the silence, or is the silence listening to you?